I don't know how many of y'all in here have read this little book. Maybe just a show of hands real quick. How many of you have read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Right, that's just one of those books that you pretty much everybody here in here is almost required to read in school. It's a good little book. And of course, in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it centers around this character, who's at war with the bad influencing him. And so Dr. Jekyll, he decides to make a potion to separate the good and the bad. And so essentially, Dr. Jekyll, he would come out at day, and then Mr. Hyde would come out at night. And so he thinks he's got a good grip on the bad, but to say the least, he doesn't. Right, because Mr. Hyde ends up killing some people, and so Dr. Jekyll, he then devises a new plan to try and reel in the bad. And so he thinks that if I just do enough good, then maybe Mr. Hyde will have less of an influence. And so he does as much good as he can, and then there's one day where he's sitting on the park bench in the daylight. He's thinking about all the good he has done, and he looks at all the people around him, and he starts comparing himself to them. And he thinks of how much better he is than they are, and then he realizes that in the day he became Mr. Hyde once again, right? And so related to this book and this idea, I'm going to read you a quote from The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. Timothy Keller says, "It is possible to avoid Jesus as Savior as much by keeping all the biblical rules as by breaking them. Both religion in which you build your identity on your moral achievements and irreligion in which you build your identity on some other secular pursuit or relationship are ultimately spiritually identical courses to take. Both are sin." So in that little book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll tries to save himself. He thinks if I just do enough good, then the bad's not going to have an influence on me. He tries to save himself. And here's the issue. The one who tries to save themselves is just as sinful as the one who does not care about being saved. See, in both cases, neither of them really care about doing the will of God. They both seek their own will. And so as an antidote, I suggest to you to will God's will. And in that picture there, it's an old picture of Golgotha, where definitely the one human who achieved God's will 100% died up on a hill for all to see, suffering. The one person who really fulfilled God's will. And so as an antidote to trying to save yourself, we got to will God's will. So John chapter 7. John chapter 7, as we continue our sermon series through the Gospel of John, verses 1 through 2 say this. "After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand." Right, this crowd of unbelieving Jews, right, these Jews that didn't understand what Jesus was trying to teach them, now they want him dead. Now keep in mind, Jesus, he's talking to he preached to these people who were hostile towards him, and he still offered them life, as we talked about last week. Now that's a hard mindset for us to have, is it not? Right? When say there's some people they want to kill us, we're probably thinking, well, I'm going to want to kill you first. But not Jesus. Not Jesus. And notice in verse 2, this feast of the Jews is near, the Feast of Booths. Now, essentially, the Feast of Booths was just a celebration for God, how God provided for them. Specifically, a celebration for how God provided for them in the wilderness. And this feast was a requirement for all native-born Jewish men. They had to go. This was part of the commandment. They had to go. You can see that in Exodus 23:16 and Deuteronomy 16, verses 13 through 17. It was a requirement. And thus, guess what it is for Jesus? As a native-born male Jew, he has to go. According to their law, he has to go. And so this would present a problem for Jesus. Keep in mind that during their feasts, during their celebrations, there would be a whole lot of foot traffic going to Judea, specifically to Jerusalem. And what people are going to be in Judea at the time? the Jews that want to kill him. Right? And so obviously this is a problem for Jesus. Verse 3, it says, "So his brothers said to him, 'Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing.'" So not only is there an obligation by the law on Jesus to go, his brothers also encourage him to go. You got to go, Jesus. And why do they say he's got to go? Well, verse 3, they say, "So that your disciples," I guess the disciples in Judea, "may also see the works that you are doing." And they continue in verse 4, "For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." Don't you want to be well known, Jesus? Don't you want fame, Jesus? Now I question if they're more concerned about Jesus' glory or just the fact that Jesus does cool things. Right? Because look at verse 5. Look at verse 5. John, the writer of this gospel, John, he includes a note here. He says, "For not even his brothers believed in him." It's kind of like an explanation for why they encourage him to go. He's saying they wanted him to go because they didn't even believe in him. How was that? Well, you see, it's not that they don't doubt his miracles. They believe in the works he's doing. They don't think his miracles are some sham. They just don't believe in him. They don't believe in their brother as Son of God, as Messiah, as Savior. They just believe in his miracles. Now keep in mind who his brothers are. You can see that in Matthew 13, verse 55. He has 4 brothers, one of which is James. James, one of the 12, James, who wrote our book in the New Testament, this James, at one point did not believe in Jesus. Yet I point out to you the immense love and grace that Jesus has for them, offering them life even in their unbelief. Even to his brothers, his own brothers who didn't believe in him, he offers them life. Verse 6, Jesus responds. He says, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here." My time has not yet come. What time is that, Jesus? Well, maybe this is referring to his glorification. Right, in John chapter 12, we read this where Jesus talks about how he's going to be lifted up, meaning he's going to be lifted up on a cross and he's going to draw all men to himself. So maybe he's talking about that glorification. Right, what man intended as the humiliation for the Messiah was really his glorification. He drew all men to himself through the crucifixion. And then he says to them, to his brothers, "Your time is always here." It's a weird thing for Jesus to say. What does he mean by that? But if it's in the context of glorification, why does he say your time for glorification is here? Verse 7 seems to give us kind of an answer. It says, "The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil." They're not hated because they are still of the world. They're not hated because they're still of the world. They think like the world. They live like the world lives. But Jesus, on the other hand, he's calling out the evil works of the world. His brothers, they're still concerned about receiving glory from one another. They're still concerned about being of the world. They don't really believe in Jesus, because if they did, they would call out the evil works of the world, but they don't. I think that's what he means when he says your time's always here. The world doesn't hate you because you still receive glory from the world. He continues on in verse 8. Jesus tells them, "You go up to the feast. I'm not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." Right? His time for his glorification has not yet fully come. To be sure, Jesus has been revealing himself, right? Through the works that he's done, he's been revealing himself, but he has not revealed himself fully. Verses 9 through 10 say, "After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private." Right? So he tells his brothers, "I'm not going to go, you go." But he still goes. But the key is, he doesn't go publicly. His brothers, they wanted him to go to Judea. They wanted him to go to Jerusalem with a big bang, so to speak. Come on, Jesus, go there, be as public as possible, garner the attention of as many as possible. And notice that his brothers, they're focused on their will. what they think is best. And this is one sign somebody doesn't will God's will. They want to make God do the things that they want him to do. Try to make God a person that doesn't make them uncomfortable. And so as brothers in this instance, also we got to keep this in mind. They probably have some sort of mindset that Jesus is a Messiah that's going to establish the Jews as a worldly power, that Jesus is going to squash Rome and then finally give Jews the glorification they so deserve. And by proxy, just say for a second, if that were Jesus, who Jesus was, then by proxy, who gets glory? The Jews. If that were who Jesus was, then his brothers, they would get glory. That's what they want. But that's not the plan. Jesus, he approaches this as a servant, one who conquers by sacrifice and serving. Jesus didn't come on earth to bend to the will of man. He didn't come down on earth to do what his brothers thought was best for him to do. Verses 11 through 13, it continues, the Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people, while some said, "He's a good man." Others said, "No, he's leading the people astray." Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Now notice here in this text, there are at least some people who are sympathetic. He's a good man. But notice that even the sympathetic ones are wrong. He's not just a good man. Jesus did not claim just to be a good man. He claimed so much more. But regardless of whatever they thought, pay close attention to verse 13. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Here's another sign you don't will God's will. You keep silent about him. Why are they afraid? Well, remember that the Jews here, they want him dead. They want to kill Jesus. So they're probably thinking, lest they identify me with him, lest I be associated with Jesus, man, I can't say anything out loud about him, because they might want to kill me too. And notice the self-centeredness, right? Notice that they're just concerned about their own will, which is, hey, I want to be safe. I don't want to be killed. When it comes to believing in Jesus, when it comes to being a Christian, it's going to be uncomfortable. Right? Do we keep silent about Jesus because we think we're going to lose some social currency if we're not silent? They were definitely concerned about that, losing some social currency. If they were identified with Jesus, man, they would be identified as heretics too. Is that on our minds? Are we afraid of losing social currency? Because quite frankly, we very well could. If we want to will God's will, we will not be silent. Verses 14 through 16, it says, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me." They're like, wow, he's kind of smart. Where did he get this learning? He didn't study under one of our well-known rabbis. That's another thing in their context. They definitely valued who was teaching over what was being taught. See, if somebody didn't study under one of their well-known rabbis, they probably wouldn't have listened to them. And Jesus, he didn't. He didn't study under one of their well-known rabbis. So like, how does he know what he's talking about? He didn't study under them. He didn't study under so-and-so. And notice that they value the men who teach over what is being taught. Go back to John chapter 5 real quick. John chapter 5, verses 43 through 44. Jesus says, "I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you'll receive him." Right? This idea, they had teachers of the law, who would appeal to their own authority for their teaching. It was more important about who they were than about the Word of God. Verse 44, "How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God?" That's their concern. They receive glory from one another. They receive glory as they come in their own name, in their own authority, teaching because they want glory. Look at verse 16 again back in John chapter 7. Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Jesus' teaching is of God the Father, not himself. Jesus is not like their rabbis who come based on their name. They want people to listen to them simply because they're so-and-so. That's not Jesus. That's not Jesus. Verse 17, Jesus says, if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. Here's another sign, if you will God's will. Do you recognize that Jesus' teachings are from God? Those who do not recognize this do not will God's will, which makes sense, right? Makes sense. After all, a lot of what Jesus teaches, a lot of what he has to say in our Bible here goes against our natural propensities and our natural desires, so it's not surprising that there are many people who are going to find him offensive. We're going to throw out his teachings as a whole because it doesn't suit well with what they think, how they view the world, because they've made themselves a god. Those who are concerned about their will, they'll either try and bend Jesus to their will, or they'll throw out Jesus' teachings as a whole. But if we will God's will, we will know that his teaching is from God, even if it's difficult. He continues, verse 18, the one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Another sign you don't will God's will, you seek your own glory, right? You appeal to yourself as validation for what you believe and what you do. Hence, the one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory. Man, how many people do that today, right? They appeal to themselves as validation for what they believe and what they do. That's our society. See, church, if you think you've got everything figured out on your own, you seek your own glory. Why? Because you think you know better than everybody else. If you appeal to yourself as a basis for what you believe and what you do you see how arrogant that is? You're claiming to know better than everyone else on earth. When we will God's will, we will know that we don't understand everything. We will know that we can't appeal to ourselves for what we do and how we believe. We can't appeal to our own authority. We don't know what's best. Just like his brothers in this passage, they think they know what is best for Jesus to do, but they don't. Jesus does. See, our will, our purpose, our timing is nothing compared to Jesus's. We can't base our belief, our worldview on our own authority. He continues in verse 19. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? Now Jesus, he's focusing in on something that they have a complaint against them. They think that Jesus has broken the law that they follow, and essentially Jesus is calling them a bunch of hypocrites. Right? You want to kill me because I broke some law, but what does that say about you? Right? How can you want to kill me if you also break the law? You want to see a good example of gaslighting? Look at verse 20. I'm sure you've heard that word quite a bit. The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who's seeking to kill you?" Right? This is a prime example of gaslighting here, okay? Right? Jesus, he's making a true assumption about them. They want to kill him. Then they say, "You got a demon." Right? Something's wrong up here, Jesus. You're all out of whack. That's a good example of gaslighting. And then Jesus, he makes it a little more clear what they have against him in verses 21 through 23. He says, Jesus answered them, "I did one work, and you all marveled at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well?" Now here Jesus, he's referring all the way back to John chapter 5. Let's go there real quick. John chapter 5, where he healed this man who was paralyzed for 38 years. Verses 15 through 18, it says, "The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So back in John chapter 7, Jesus, he calls out their hypocrisy. They break the Sabbath in order to perform circumcision on a man. Jesus breaks the Sabbath by healing a man that has been paralyzed 38 years. Now, mind you, they think it's okay, think about this, they think it's okay for them to literally cut something away from a man on the Sabbath, but God forbid, Jesus make a man whole on the Sabbath. Do you see the irony there? What's more important? What's more valuable? Not to mention it, you can go back to the sermon, it's called Restless. It's on the YouTube page. Jesus' healing on the Sabbath, in a way, is actually a fulfillment of the Sabbath. So if you want to go back to that, you can look at that, the sermon Restless. But the Jews, they're far more concerned. They're far more concerned about a man being outwardly Jewish on the Sabbath than Jesus making a man whole on the Sabbath. And Jesus here, he highlights one last thing about how they do not will God's will. Verse 24. "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." You don't will God's will if you judge by appearances. Right? If you're just concerned about how the outside looks, you're not actually concerned about God's will. Okay? If you are concerned about God's will, you're going to be by far more concerned about the inside, the heart, the mind. And notice how this played out in our passage, how they're by far more concerned about appearances. Jesus' brothers, "Hey, Jesus, go down to Judea so you can make a big public appearance so that you can be well known, so you can have fame." They're concerned about appearances. And the Jews, right? Concerned about keeping the law to a T, making sure that a man is outwardly Jewish on the Sabbath. They're concerned about appearances. Now, it's no secret, church. It's really no secret. I'm going to be honest with you for a second. It's no secret that many of us, I'm including all of us, many of us come to church with a mask on. Let's be honest for a second. We have a tendency to think that, all right, I got to go to church. Let me make sure I'm all together outwardly. Quite literally, let me make sure that I got my suit on, my nice shoes on. Make sure everything looks good. Let me make sure that I'm acting properly. Make sure the appearance is good, even if the heart is not good. We're going to have a very difficult time being Christian if we're just concerned about the outside, appearances. Let me tell you something. I would rather you come to church honestly, even if you think it looks ugly. I'm not talking about appearances. I'm talking about if you've got something going on in your life that you're struggling with. Don't put on a mask thinking that it's going to be better off if I just fake it. I got to look presentable. I got to act like I got everything together. No, you don't. Quite frankly, the moment that you try to act like you have everything, probably the moment that you don't have anything together. How is Christ going to be able to work on you if you just keep putting up a mask? It's like another attempt to save yourself. I'm not going to pretend that I've never done this. Sure, yeah, there are times when I come to church. I feel some obligation to put on some sort of mask, even if I don't feel good, even if maybe there's some anger, maybe there's something going on, maybe there's something going on in my heart. We shouldn't do that. We got to feel like we're in a place where we can be honest with one another. A place where we don't have to put on a mask. We can't be about appearances. A Savior on a cross is not a good appearance. A servant waiting on a table really is not a good appearance. Church, we got to will God's will. We got to forget about our comfort, our will, our glory. We got to will God's will. So if you have not willed God's will, if you'd like to take the first step, you can be immersed into Christ as we stand and sing.